Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Lynn Mooney, and I am co-owner of Women and Children First Bookstore in Chicago. I'm thrilled to be here today, and I want to welcome all of you for what I'm sure is going to be a rich and fascinating conversation. First, though, we begin our online events the same way we began our in-store events, and that is with a land acknowledgement. The area we now call Chicago, including the land where Women and Children First Bookstore is located, is the traditional homeland of the people of the Council of Three Fires, which included the Ojibwe and Potawatomi tribes. This area has long been a vibrant site of trade, life, and community making, and is today home to 65,000 Native people. As the current occupants of this land, many of us are here as part of the legacy of the forced removal of Indigenous people by a settler colonial state. We believe that taking a moment to make this statement is a step toward honoring this truth and healing and reconciliation. It can become more meaningful when coupled with authentic relationships and sustained commitment. I urge anyone interested, whether you're in Chicago or not, to support local organizations such as the American Indian Center and Native art and artists, activists and organizers, and others in our community. Next, I'm going to make two quick housekeeping announcements. One, attendees, please type your questions into the Ask a Question feature at the bottom of your screen. We love all your enthusiasm in chat, but it can make the questions hard to find. So please do use the Ask a Question feature. And I know a couple of you have already done so, and we're excited about getting to those later. And two, if you don't have a copy of True Love yet, please use the Buy the Book box located at the bottom of the screen. Women and Children First is always happy to be your local neighborhood bookstore, no matter where you live. So this afternoon, it is my great pleasure to introduce two writers whose work I enjoy and admire so much, Tessa Hadley and Rebecca Makkai. And I want to welcome both of you back. Unfortunately, I'm welcoming Rebecca back in absentia. She's a little bit delayed. She will be joining us in about 15 minutes. And she asked me to extend her sincerest apologies to all of you for that delay. She will be joining us, but just a little bit later. Okay, first, Tessa Hadley, whose work has been compared to Chekhov and Jane Austen, and who the novelist Anne Enright called an immensely subversive writer. She is the author of 7 novels, including Clever Girl, The Past, and Late in the Day. Her stories regularly appear in The New Yorker, and 2 of her story collections, Sunstroke and Other Stories, and Married Love and Other Stories, were New York Times notable books. She is the recipient of the Wyndham Campbell Prize and the Hawthornden Prize, and her work has been longlisted for the Orange Prize. She is also a reviewer for the London Review of Books and is a creative writing professor at Bath Spa University. We are here today because of her terrific new novel, Free Love. This story of the intellectual and sexual awakening of a 40-year-old suburban housewife in vibrant 1960s London is enriched with carefully wrought portraits of women making courageous choices about their lives, in poignant contrast with one woman who decades earlier had not done so. Tessa will be in conversation, knock on wood, with Rebecca Makkai, the author of the novels The Great Believer, The 100-Year House, and The Borrower, and the short story collection Music for Wartime. The Great Believers was awarded the ALA Carnegie Medal and the LA Times Book Prize, among other honors, and was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize and the National Book Award. Makkai is on the MFA faculties of Sierra Nevada College and Northwestern University, and she is Artistic Director of Story Studio Chicago. Thank you all again for being here. Thank you, and I'm going to turn it over now to Tessa, who's going to talk about the book a bit and do some reading to get us started.
Hello, thank you, Lynn. Thank you for that. And it's so nice to be back in your bookshop again, even if only virtually. I wish I was there in Chicago in person. It's a crazy, stormy weekend in Wales this week. We've had amazing gusts and gales, and it would be quite nice to be thousands of miles away on the lakes. I'm going to start by doing some reading and talking a little bit about where this book began, where it came from, why I wrote what is in a way my first historical novel set in the 1960s. It's interesting to ask, is that a historical novel? Is there a sort of boundary? It's still I was a child in the time I've set this book. Doesn't feel like writing a Victorian book set 100 or 150 years ago, and yet it also was distinctly not like writing something contemporary. So we'll talk about that, I'm sure. But to start off, to get a bit of a flavour of the book inside the room, I was going to say, I suppose this is a room, a virtual room. To get a flavour of the book inside the room, I'll start reading from the very beginning. So no explanation needed. Page 1, chapter 1. In fact, the very first sentences that I wrote, and that are still the first sentences of this story. This Friday evening in late summer was so lovely that Phyllis Fischer sat at her dressing table with the window wide open onto the garden. Life flowed into the room from beyond the window in its drowsy suburban evening stream, the steady relieving splash of a hose in a herbaceous border, confiding clack of shears, distant thwack of balls from the tennis club, broken sharp cries of children playing, fragrance of cut grass and roasting meat, jiggling of ice in the first weekend gin and tonics. When slanting low sunlight was suddenly blinding in one wing of the dressing table mirror, Phyllis adjusted it and the light ran instead around the cut glass toiletry set and her bottles of Lait du Temps and witch hazel and cleansing milk. She sat forward in her petticoat, leaning on her elbows to see more clearly in the mirror, feeling the flirting of the breeze on her bare shoulders, smelling the soap on her skin. She was 40. But still had an expectant, animated prettiness. Her sandy tanned face was brushed with faint freckles across the upturned nose. Her rather dry, fair hair, not yellow, but a shadowed gold like washed out straw, was back-combed into volume for tonight and stiff with hairspray. She put on pale lipstick carefully, pressing her lips together, frowning at the mirror, because she thought that her mouth was too big, too soft and indefinite, as if she might blurt out something coarse or raw. In fact, she was easy, an easy person, easily made happy, glad to make others happy. She was pleased with her life. The year was 1967. Her dress for this evening waited like a friend, hooked on its hanger over the wardrobe door, empire line with a skirt that ended above the knee, green chiffon with bold vertical red and orange stripes, green ground ribbon sewn under the bust, fastened in a bow in front. She had asked Mandy Veery to press it for her before she went home. No need to keep Mandy on to help serve dinner because it wasn't a formal dinner party. The young man who was coming, Nicholas Knight, might turn out anyway to be a bore. Phyllis had a dim memory that he'd been a bore as a small boy. She'd met him long ago when she was first married to Roger, and her daughter Colette was a colicky baby. At 9 or 10 years old, Nicholas had been owlish with a big heavy head and black-framed thick glasses, brimming with factual knowledge, insisting that they test him on flags and capitals of the world. Patiently, Roger had obliged. Phyllis's anticipation of Nicholas's friend this evening was only buoyant because she liked entertaining, and because he was a man, after all, even if he turned out to be gauche and unattractive. She liked men. She couldn't help herself. Though there was no question of her flirting with Nicholas, who was nearer to the age of her own daughter. The children playing outside were screaming now with excitement at the climax of some pursuit, weaving on their secret paths around the gardens in the hot light, ducking behind clipped high privet hedges or pushing through thickets of rank shrubbery, rhododendron and hydrangea, poisonous spotted laurel, stiff bamboo. Some of these gardens ran to half an acre or more, and the children had made dens in the scraps of woodland at their far ends where they arrived at the river out of parental reach. One garden of an abandoned house was an overgrown wilderness, and they had worked themselves up into a horror of coming upon dead things in there. They knew all the broken places in fences for squeezing through, streaking their clothes with lichen stains or tearing them on nails. An adult opened an upstairs window in one of the nearby houses in the Fischers cul-de-sac to shout at them. With a splash and a cry, a child missed a stepping stone in a fish pond, lifting in dismay a dripping sandal, a soaked sock, but there was no time to stop. The others were pitiless. "You idiot!" one of them sharply exclaimed. Phyllis thought with exhilaration that her son Hugh would be running with them, perhaps out at the front of the tribe, leading the way. She ought to lean out of the window and call to Hugh to come inside. It was time for his supper, but she was still in her petticoat, and anyway, couldn't make herself be offended by the children's exuberance. She felt with them the promise of the evening, the gathering shadows, the pang of ending. I'll stop there.
Thank
Rebecca,
you.
welcome. How did you do that?
I am so sorry. So for people, I'm not sure what was explained to everyone. Signals were crossed, and I thought we were doing this later. And I was wondering how on earth Tessa would do this in the middle of the night, but somehow never. When Sarah got hold of me, I was not in my house, but fortunately close enough that
Somehow you've time traveled back. And
yes. I drove a little fast to get home, but safely, responsibly. And I'm so, although it's, earlier than I expected to get to meet you, I'm so delighted to meet you.
It's lovely to meet you.
And if we were, if I'd managed to do this right and we were meeting sort of backstage, I think I'd be just acknowledging, and I'll do it now. I've been a fan for a long time, which I think because I reviewed late in the day for the New York Times.
I mean, we probably should almost not do this in public, Rebecca, but it was such a lovely review. And it was lovely because you were so nice about the book, but even better, some of the things you said were so what I wanted people to read. So honestly, one of my favorite reviews I've ever had. So
that makes me incredibly happy. And I know there is a difference, of course, a good review is a good review. We will take it any day,
sure.
Right?
Even if they get the whole plot wrong and misunderstand everything, if they love it, hey. But yours was so not that. Yes, you said something lovely, which I don't know whether, obviously we'll get down a bit more into the detail of this book, but you said something about realism and how in one sense my books were old-fashioned and I was writing in a realist way, which having read The Great Believers is sort of your way too. And then you were saying, but there is a way of doing that old-fashioned thing of taking a reader over the threshold into what seems to be a real place, though it's just an illusion, with real characters in it doing real things to each other. And yet there is a way of using that old-fashioned force of the realist novel to do something that nonetheless feels contemporary, and that my heart just
I'm so glad. I'm so glad. And I think I can't remember if in that review I brought up Virginia Woolf, which I think of in not to make too facile a comparison at all. And I don't know what her influence has been on your work, but I see a similar, I think it's that. I think it's the thing you just paraphrased, me paraphrasing, but a similar way of slowing down time, focusing on what would perhaps in lesser hands be quite mundane details, like this sandal that ends up essentially launching the whole plot, if you haven't read it yet.
Yes, that little splash that we hear in passing in there, which just seems like an incidental detail.
Right, there's the splash and then the ripples last for the whole book, essentially, right?
Yes.
I hope no one gets the idea wrong and thinks it's an entire novel about a sandal, but it sets everything in motion, certainly, right?
Yeah, and that's the kind that's something that realism is so good at doing, is taking the contingent, the accidental, the sandal, the baked beans on toast, whatever it is, and making that both. It is digressive. It is just the stuff of life that you're putting in there to make the book lifelike, but it also sort of plays its part in driving your meaning and your story and your purposes forward. Yeah,
right. Without, and I think there are ways of doing that. You know, certainly there are writers I admire to the moon and back who really, you know, these. It's not real life. It's not the texture of the real moment. An object is bigger than that object. It has other meanings. What's amazing about something like that sandal is it is just a sandal. It is not something imbued with greater meaning. It's not some portentous thing. It's not, you know, it's not symbolic. I would pity the, you know, high school junior trying to write a paper on what the sandal symbolizes.
Imagery of sandals. It's a bit like when we first meet, and in about a page on from where I left off, we meet Colette, who is Phyllis's daughter, who's 15 and is struggling with an English essay. Not that she's not clever, she's very clever, but she's trying to please her beloved new teacher. And what does she have to write? Something about themes of light and dark, I think.
Yes, it's just very strange.
Yeah, and I sort of love handing her the idea of the symbolism of footwear in, you know, Shakespearean comedies or something.
Right. Well, and where someone like Woolf, who I think, you know, you do something similar in the slowing of the moment, but I think she does do things that are a bit more loaded or portentous, or, you know, just
you know what it is that I really love of that era, because you've absolutely put your finger on the right moment in British fiction, and it is those women writers of the early to mid 20th century are kind of huge for me. But it is actually Elizabeth Bowen is the one who I think she conjures a texture that's recognizably in the same universe as Woolf. They were contemporaries, they knew each other, admired each other. There's something, what is it with Bowen that this, no, with Woolf, I think what I miss in her books, and this is now slightly sidestepping from this very interesting discussion about the accidental and the pointed in realism, but I think I miss eros in her books. And I don't mean actual love affairs and sex, which I suppose are there, are they? Not that much. But it's not that. It's the charge inside stuff. There's something angsty and self-conscious and cerebral, actually, which is a cheap word to use about her, but I probably do really think it is a bit cerebral to me. Whereas Bowen, who is every bit as clever and whose writing is charged in a kind of Woolf-like way, but she's got this, she's sort of enamored at all the embodiment around her: hills, mountains, suitcase, car, pub, you know, everything is charged with the life force for Bowen. And that I sometimes have her books open beside me as I write to set my marker very high. Does that, do you know her?
What's that?
Do you know Bowen?
Not personally.
Yes, I do. Sadly.
No, as soon as you said the women writers of that era, I was about to say Elizabeth Bowen, because I can see that. I think she's not as well known. And if you're in the chat, especially, you know, Americans in the chat, I would say start with The House in Paris. I'm not sure what
definitely. The House in Paris is pretty perfect, actually, I think. I always, there's just one thing that happens in the middle that I wish was different, but there we are. Never mind. No, The House in Paris is perfection, and Death of the Heart as well is just a lovely, lovely novel, and so readable, actually, and page turny, but with this sort of intensity. So you do know that every item is both an accidental happening in a room and full of the story. And I kind of think that charging up of a sandal or a suitcase is not just a trick that writers do. I kind of think it's a dimension in human imagination that we do it as we live, and we fill the truly accidental things that surround us, that come to hand, with a sort of pointedness. We're making up that story and that narrative drive in our own lives, and that writers just then do that on the page.
And I think that Phyllis, basically your main character, does that herself. She
absolutely. You're so right. Because here, what happens the same evening? Sandal's gone in. The young man comes to supper. They don't. Phyllis and the young man, Nicky, don't seem to be getting on very well. He thinks that she's an old woman. She suddenly thinks she's missed out on her life, and then they go out in search of this ridiculous sandal. The boy's mother phones up. She wants them to go and find it. And out there in the dark, kind of something, the sentence is here, something is unhinged under the surface of suburbia. And Nicky kisses her, almost just because he thinks, this is very bourgeois, I should do something outrageous. And he sort of idly kisses her. But then I say, Phyllis was thinking already that Nicky was her lover, or would become it. No one had kissed her like that, so wetly and hungrily in all the years of her marriage. That space had been unfilled in her passionate nature. There had been one other man she'd briefly loved long ago in Cairo before Roger, but that affair had turned into something ugly, and she'd buried the memory of it, marrying Roger instead, reacting against passion, seeming to see through it and believing she could live without it. This version of her life story was spooling through her mind, even as she kissed Nicky. Now she thought that she'd been waiting all this time to find him. And there's just a lovely sort of, I shouldn't say lovely because I wrote it.
You can say lovely.
Well, I mean, I'm meaning lovely about the thing, not about me putting it down there. That it's amusing in somebody's consciousness to this sort of paper sliver of distance between you. If I'd asserted she had been waiting all this time to find him, that's a romantic novel. But if I write, now she thought that she'd been waiting all this time to find him, that's irony. And a bit of romance as well. So that's...
It's more of a psychological novel than it's more, this is something, the sense of fate and the sense of an inciting incident, the sense of momentousness comes from the psychology of the characters rather than from the authorial hand manipulating this universe. And I think that, when you're in a love story, you're in a mystery, you're in a sort of story with the ambience of genre around it, which can be very, very fun. There's a sense of, someone up here, author God, is creating these sort of rules, creating the cause and effect, controlling the fate. And the fact, I think here, that we have an inciting incident that is only an inciting incident, not because of it. I mean, in reality, it's because the author wrote it, right? We're forgetting that doesn't feel that it's coming from a sense of the shape of a story. Here we go. Here's a narrative arc. So of course this has to happen, but because this character decides, I'm in a story.
Yeah.
And
she thinks this is my narrative arc. Exactly. Yeah.
You mentioned that force of Eros, and this is one of the main things I want to talk to you about. And I don't think, because it happens early and because of what you just read, I'm not spoiling anything. I'll be careful of things later. But they really, Phyllis and Nicky really embark on an affair with some of the trappings of, the romantic filmic version of a love affair that they're thinking of. She comes I think it's every Wednesday, is it right? To his kind of artist's loft kind of apartment and this in London, and he's quite smitten with her, and she's smitten not only with him, of course, but with she feels like she's losing her youth, she's losing her son, lots of other things going on there. The direction I want to go in this actually is to say, really, unusual to see in any kind of book, movie, anything, an affair depicted between a younger man and an older woman, older than him. And
yeah, you're right. You're right. It's perhaps not
there
the
are
common way
examples,
around. Or we
right?
have stories like The Graduate, which the film I'm thinking of now, which actually punishes the older woman at the end in a slightly, well, a very distressing way. I think he should have stayed with her, but but you're right. You're right. It's, and I suppose when I began the book and set up the story, and I was already looking around the romance in the way we've been talking about, and seeing its ironies, and perhaps seeing it's not going to last forever, and there are going to be all sorts of ripples outward that are going to affect other people, and I can follow that through in my story. But I did realize, if you're going to make this novel work, you actually have to write a very torrid sexual affair. Otherwise, nothing. Otherwise, no center, no book, nothing worth writing home about. So, however ironic to a certain extent my treatment is, I had to be wholehearted about it as well. And then I had to think about a woman who, I mean, she's 40, isn't she? And it was funny when I read that first paragraph where it says she was 40, but still pretty and attractive. And actually my editor did say, shouldn't it be and? And I said, not in 1967. I think that's changed. I think now it would definitely be, she was 40 and still attractive.
Right.
But I think in 1967, 40 was scary. It was a watershed moment for women. Remember my own mum, I'm trying to think when she would have, she wouldn't be quite 40 in 1967, but when she did turn 40, it was a big and scary thing that she concealed, and did funny things like faked her name, faked her date of birth on documents and things. So
my mother was born in 1936, and we celebrated her 29th birthday for years. I mean, it was just a joke, but it was, we got the candles on the cake every year, 29, 29, 29.
Yeah, I know.
It's there's something interesting going on as well in the book with generations in terms of their relation to the war, in terms of their relation, the characters, someone like Nikki coming along and saying early on, well, you all were a great generation, you fought this war, but I wouldn't want that. I'm not jealous. That sounds horrible. And someone like Phyllis, who's maybe a little bit in between, was a teenager, wasn't old enough. She said she would have been one of those, the people watching for planes, but she was 17. And I'm so interested about the confluence between, this is obviously not your own generation. You're writing about a time, you said maybe your own mother was a little younger than that. So, but looking back on this, this very interesting generational moment, where there's this modernization of thinking that Nikki really represents in many ways. He's trying at least to be very bohemian. There's still this long shadow of the war. I'm curious.
It was, I mean, we're used to thinking about the 60s as that moment where the tectonic plates of our cultural lives in North America, in Britain, in Western Europe really shifted. And it was the end of a period of class hierarchy, of deference. Perhaps this is that probably describes Britain a little better than it describes America. Other things were going on in your country. Something broke up, and a new kind of surge of possibility erupted. But one has to think about that, just as you've been saying, in relation to the generation before. And I think when we look at young Nicky in the chapter, he's in his mid-20s, reacting to Phyllis's husband, who actually he's more interested in when he first comes to dinner, really, than he is in Phyllis. He hardly notices Phyllis at first. There is some Oedipal struggle between the wise, shrewd, reserved, smart older man with his record as a war hero. He was at Monte Cassino, he was brave, he actually has a damaged hand, although that comes from later in Egypt. The young man feels the weight of all that and the impossibility of matching it in its own terms. And I'm sure that was some truth about that eruption of new being in the 1960s, was that it was partly a reaction to the fading heroism of what had happened 20 years previously.
Yes.
And that story between the older and younger man in the book is another part of the history that I'm trying to chart in there.
Yeah. It's almost sort of, you're not going to have that story, but you need to have a story. And so
yeah.
What is that going to be? And it's got to be a rebellion, of course, against the older generations. So, yeah.
Let's demonstrate against the war. There's a demonstration in the book that's sort of done obliquely. I don't go there directly, but against the Vietnam War. We weren't in. Britain didn't join America in the Vietnam War, but we demonstrated against it. And that's what we'll do. That will be our heroism and our drama and our testing ground, rather than, the campaign in Italy or whatever. Yes.
It's almost as if within this affair, they're both reaching in some strange way towards the other generation for personal reasons, and then almost for generational reasons, where, her son is about to be sent off to boarding school. She's sort of losing her son in a way, reaching out, to her lost child in a sense, but also her own lost youth, her own and then he's reaching in this kind of Oedipal way, as you said. None of it though feels terribly heavy-handed or planted. It feels, again, as I was saying before, it's not as if it's in there for the sake of the book. It's in there because that would really be what would make these characters tick psychologically.
It's funny. I mean, one doesn't know, does one? When, a story comes to you, and this story, it was wonderful, and this will not happen to me again. It did all sort of come in one piece.
Really?
And the first pages of the notebook for this novel, it's all there. I really think all the main twists and turns all came in one. That really doesn't. The one I'm now embarked on something new, and I have absolutely no idea. I have a horrible chart which I'm actually looking at as I speak, with a sort of lovely wavy line that then just goes off into dots, because I really don't know what's going to happen. That's much more usual. But this one, maybe because I was writing about something that's almost history, it seemed to come all of a piece, and I saw into the individual stories of these characters, and through them into how they did represent that transitional moment, and all the different elements in play, and all the different ways you could look at it, really, with sympathy, without sympathy, feeling sorry for or feeling admiration for that older generation, feeling moved by the vitality of the younger generation. And putting the novel's great, isn't it, for doing that? You don't have to make up your mind. You could just put those two forces and possibilities side by side,
and contradictions and all.
And contradictions. Yeah, exactly. I mean, I really myself hold the contradictions that I set out in this novel, and I suppose that really was part of why I wanted to write it. I genuinely feel, like Phyllis's husband, that it is better to have a pragmatic politics, to be pessimistic about possibilities, to do the best you can, to deal with the material you have. And then I genuinely feel, like Phyllis, that sometimes you have an insight into things being so terrible, so deeply corrupted, that you sort of want to shed the world you've inherited like a skin and be born into something free, and you want to refuse it. And I think the one gesture of pessimistic realism and the other gesture of a kind of repudiating idealism, I can't actually choose between them myself. So then, being a novelist, thank goodness, and not a politician, I can just put both those gestures side by side.
It's something that I'm always, I teach writing quite a lot, and I'm always trying to encourage my students to run directly into contradictions. And, I think that our initial, when we're beginning writing, our tendency is to want to choose and simplify and right, whether it's in terms of a character or in terms of what the novel is saying, out of fear that if we don't say the same thing again and again, the reader won't understand. And in fact, it's just not interesting to do that.
Not interesting, and I mean, just being greedy about contradiction, of course, it generates material for you to write. Whereas if you are simply writing a book, let's say, to say climate change is bad, that only actually takes a few pages. I'm being facetious, and that's not the whole truth. And I certainly don't think you can write a book which says, oh, maybe climate change is fine, but it doesn't. Climate change is bad doesn't generate material. It's why the novel is not actually very good, I think, at writing about climate change. I don't quite know how to put that politics into a novel successfully. There have been a few, but they're few and far between. Contradiction is brilliant, because out of it flows this endless back and forth and this contrast, and you can go on developing that argument, if you like, not as a naked argument, but through your characters and through their experiences and their choices.
I've had that same frustration with a lot of what's getting called cli-fi, climate fiction.
I knew it must have a name.
Yes. I feel like every one of those novels, there's some of them that I've found brilliant, but the joke I have with a couple of friends is every single one of them within the first 20 pages needs to find some way to tell you that the bees are dead. And there's someone mentions, do you remember bees? Or, and it
just a pot of honey.
right. And it again and again, everyone remind me that the bees died. This is, I should say before I say anything else, this is a good time for people to type questions into the question box, and there are a couple there, but I'll get to them in just a minute or two. So if you have questions while we talk, that would be a great time to put them there. You mentioned, and I'm not going to ask you too much about it, don't worry, but you mentioned the next project you're working on, and I think it's this wonderful and horrible irony that we're always, by the time we're talking about a completed book, we are hopefully in the muck, probably at just the muckiest possible place in a new novel, right? You think, I imagine you finished this maybe a year and a half ago.
Yep.
And about a year and a half into a new novel is just good.
Not quite. It's not quite like that. My timing isn't quite like that. So you're right. I finished it in November 2020, I think. And then, of course, there are rewrites and there's reworking and all of that. So actually, I started my new one this last November, just gone, and it really is quite new. So it perhaps hasn't had time to get into the mucky bit yet, which I so recognise. When you're committed to it. I think I'm still playing with it, which is fun. Yes. I'm putting it down to me. Does this work? Do I love it? I think I do. Are these characters alive? The question of what I'm going to do with them exactly, that remains fairly ahead. But no, I'm still in the playful stage before the whole world becomes, you have to drag it forwards, and each step is quite painful. That does happen at some point in the middle.
It's simultaneously, at least for me, to talk about the old book when the new book is at whatever stage, it's simultaneously heartening because you have this reminder of, yes, I do know how to complete a novel. I did one, here's this thing. But at the same time, the contrast between them is just so stunning, of this thing that other people helped you polish, and it's been, it was copy edited within an inch of its life, and then the pile of Post-its on your desk that you're hoping will turn into something.
Yes. No, this is true. It's funny though. I think once the book for me is in a book, it strangely seals itself shut. And although I know it's mine, absolutely, one funny thing is I don't go on wanting to rewrite it. I don't read a bit thinking, sometimes I do, but very rarely thinking, I wish I'd done that differently. I wish I'd done it, which I could have done up to the point it's done. And suddenly here it is in covers. And it's as if it's not exactly mine anymore. It sort of belongs out there. So one has such a different feeling about that sealed off book and this open book that remains to be written. They feel very different species. But you're right. It's also good, and you do think, oh well, I did write one once, but you also think I'll never do that again. Of course, you know all this.
Right. How did I do that? Yeah, we do have some good questions in here, and the first one. This does get at maybe some of what I was getting at in that Times review about the sort of timeless. I'm not sure I said timeless, but that this question does. But that sort of that quality of writing that does not feel tethered, to present moment or trends. So the question here from Joe is: just reread the story An Abduction. The first line terrified me and I was thrilled and relieved how the story evolved. Loved when the young girl, no longer innocent, returns home, changed to oblivious parents. This question is sort of separate from that, when the question is, how do you make your work seem timeless?
Well, do you know, it's marvelous, Joe, that you picked on that story, because writing that story set in the 1960s, set in the home counties, which won't be resonant in Chicago as it is in England. The home counties are sort of those counties surrounding London, and certainly in the 40s, 50s, 60s, 20s, 30s, they had an almost comical reputation as being suburban, respectable, the dreary commuters in bowler hats with rolled umbrellas sort of coming in and out of the city and Whitehall. And they were the epitome of uptight Englishness and its comedy. And I have never lived there. It's not my world at all. But for some reason, because they've vanished completely, that old England has gone. Instead of seeming slightly ridiculous and awful as it used to, that little world seemed rich for writing. When I wrote that short story, An Abduction, I kind of loved imagining how stuffy it was and how narrow those lives and how oblivious those parents were as their daughter was abducted. And it was writing that short story, I am sure of it, that made me want to write this novel, Free Love. I kept thinking how much I'd enjoyed doing it, and how, again, we're talking about this business of which subjects or which setups and which subjects offer the most riches for the writer to draw out of them, the most to do. And it seemed there was so much to do writing about that home counties, tame suburban world in the 1960s. And just as in the story, dropping into the mixture the wildness of youth and sexual daring and outrage, which of course was what happened mid-decade. And that's what happened in that short story. Some boys pick a girl up from her front gate where she's idly waiting for something, life, and kind of return her the next day, as Joe says, utterly changed and yet looking exactly as she did the day before. And that whole play of safety and wildness is such a good story. So that story, and I don't think it's timeless. I couldn't write that story or this novel set now. They depend for all their effects actually on being there. And I'm not much of a believer in essential qualities, including essential. What is it like to fall in love? I think it actually feels different to fall in love as a 40-year-old suburban housewife in 1967 than it would to fall in love as a 40-year-old publisher in 2022. I think I'm more of an anthropologist than an essentialist in all of that, and I think the novel is so brilliant at capturing the precision of a given moment in history, in place, in time, and that's what I've really exploited and drawn on in both that short story you mentioned and in this novel.
Yeah, I love that. That's fantastic. We have a question from Sarah, pointing out that you write so well about the senses, particularly scent, which Sarah feels like we don't see commonly in books. Did your use of all the senses in your characters start out as a deliberate writing choice, or was it a surprise? As you're thinking, I will say that there's a moment of garlic breath in this book that is really striking. That's the first thing I think.
In the 60s or in the 70s, when I can read, you could smell garlic on people because not everybody ate garlic. I can remember that. Whereas now, of course, we all eat it. We all smell of it. It's delicious. Who could possibly cook without garlic? But I know that it was otherwise because I can remember smelling garlic on people and being very aware of it.
Oh my God.
That's fascinating. That it isn't something I've done deliberately, but I do think when I'm trying to, I've got a scene in my imagination and I'm trying to put it onto the page, the screen. It's very important to me to get the light and the smells and the aura, the atmospheric of the whole scene. And I don't know in advance which ingredients I will need to complete that scene and make it right. I've just been writing a very early morning in a winter garden. And, it took me ages to sort of put down this, the trunks of the trees and the mist and the damp gravel, those, and it's definitely some smells. I had dungy earth and pungent greenery. I don't know if they'll survive through to the final edit, but that they're there at the moment. Smell is incredibly powerful, isn't it? Incredibly evocative. And interestingly, never thought this before, but I'm just thinking it. I think writing a smell on the page does have an effect on the reader if it works, if you can make it work. Whereas there are real problems with sound. I think putting music on the page is immensely difficult. I think it's so difficult to conjure the power of music. I tried. I have one scene in here when Phyllis has, I have to give away, abandoned her respectable suburbia, and she's sort of she's shedding her skin and finding a new life. And she spends a night alone in a room, which is a bare room, and she loves the bareness of it instead of the furnished room of her home. And she plays Bob Dylan and dances to it by herself. And I hope that by sort of listing and putting on the page all the atmospherics that surround that musical moment, that transfiguring musical moment, I can just get a little whisper of it anyway. But I think music's harder than smell. And I think if you put lemon or garlic or stew or wine or earth on the page, interestingly, I think that actually breathes out of the page. I've never ever thought about that before.
They say neurologically it triggers memory more than other senses. I wonder what kind of tests have we done with putting, electrodes on someone's brain as they
shouldn't we? And then people read a page about a lemon being squeezed, and then they read a page about somebody playing a Joni Mitchell song, and they see which response is the strongest.
We could get funding for this.
We could get funding for this. It's a Nobel Prize, I reckon.
If there's anyone in the audience with neurologist connections and a grant to give us, we have a question about how your approach of writing a novel compares to writing short stories, and whether you prefer the novel form now. Certainly anyone here, I think that so often as you're thinking of your answer, readers, tend to come to a writer first through their novels, because those are out there a little more publicly, but if you don't know Tessa's short fiction, this is your invitation and strong recommendation to it. But where do you stand on it now? What's moving you?
As a reader, just to say in passing, I really do. One always resents the fact that people love novels and people don't read short stories, and you feel defensive of the story. But I actually do know why I love short stories. I do know why fewer readers love them. It's because they're so strenuous to read that you read one and you kind of have to hold on till you get to the end in order to even quite get what it is and what it's there for. And then it chucks you out, and then you have to start a second one, and you're learning all the new characters again and all the whole point of it again. You're holding on. It's a more strenuous reading. There is something delicious about a novel which you pick up every night, every morning, or every afternoon, hopefully hours of every day, and you plunge back into the same stream of story, and it becomes your story in your world, and you almost can't remember whether you belong in the world of Jane Eyre or or Dickens or whatever it is, or D.H. Lawrence, or whether you belong in your own world. So I really do actually, I think it is, the enchantment of the novel is so powerful, and who wants to naysay that? But of course, stories are so exquisite, and when they're good. When I'm writing them, I kind of tend to know straight away when I have a glimpse of a bit of story, whether it's going to be short or long, and a story just feels like it's the one thing, and the test, the difficulty is, right, you've got your little premise, you've got this lovely thing you've glimpsed. Now, where are you going to put it down? And why have you picked it up? And when you put it down, will they know why you've picked it up? What's the point of it, in a way? And that's, I've made that sound easy. That's so hard. And it's so hard to get a story to the right place. But once you know what you're doing with the story, there is a lovely irresponsibility about writing them. And in the end, if it goes wrong, you can throw it away and you weep and feel you're a failure. But, it's only been 2 months of your life.
Yes.
This is not true of the novel. So the novel is a serious undertaking, and it's huge. And there's a lovely freedom in these opening passages that I'm in now. And then there's some point in the middle when it does feel a bit like a marriage, and you really know that novel so well, and you think, why this novel and not another one? And you sometimes read it through and you think, I don't love it anymore. Right. But hopefully, as with a good marriage, it all plays out in the end, and you think, oh no, I do know, and then now the analogy with marriage, I think, breaks down, so we'll ignore that. There's a lovely point in the book where it then runs down to its finale, and it has a good inevitability, and that can be very joyous to write. Is there so much more spade work and muscle work with a novel? You actually have to do more real delving. You're keeping your intuition alight, because if that isn't there, nothing's there. But at the same time, you're thinking, but come on, the muscles of my brain, I got to connect that to that, and I've got to do something with that. And if he's there in May and she's pregnant, what can I, there's all that work to do, which is fascinating work, but tough work. And it seems to involve a slightly different bit of the brain.
All these, ancillary documents, calendars and timelines. Exactly. Yes. And then the bit when it doesn't work, and you think, oh no, I've just realized it can't be spring. I've written that exquisite passage of them walking, but no, if it's spring, then she would be. There are those switches. Yes. I want to add, though, really quickly, I think something about, and some Star is noting in the chat, a lovely irresponsibility. It's just a wonderful way to think about that relation to the short story. I think that's one reason that we can see, one of several reasons that we can see more experimentation within a short story, more of the edges of what a certain author is capable of or willing to do. Another reason being that you can sustain things sometimes for 6 pages that you can't or wouldn't want to sustain for 350 pages. I think that's really fascinating. You sometimes just think,
I love these characters for this long, and I think they would pall upon me if I lived with them for longer. They have this much story in them, sort of thing. And that now that sounds belittling, and that's not quite what I mean. But it's sort of, you want to treat them with the lightness that suits them and the thing you have to show about them, and you don't want to belabor them. So or to put it the other way around, if you're going to live with your characters for a novel's length, you've actually got to feel they've got a lot in them that you're going to be able to go on drawing upon, and that they've got change in them. I think that was one of the things that I sort of loved drawing out in writing this book, was watching Phyllis's change, watching her daughter's change, watching, rather tragically, I think, her son's change, watching all of that, watching Nikki, her lover's change, change actually from a somewhat gauche kind of young man into someone quite devastatingly attractive, even as possibly, I'm not saying too much, but possibly the thing between them is running out of steam, but she's done something for him. Do you know, I was deliberately conscious, nobody's noticed it, but I was thinking of Henry James, The Ambassadors, where middle-aged man goes to fetch a sort of young clodhopper American back from Paris, where he's fallen under the wiles of a wicked Parisian woman. And discovers that he's been transformed into an elegant, desirable, sophisticated by his love affair with this woman. And I was consciously thinking about that when I had Nikki sort of become smoothed out and filled out his masculinity in a way that boy at the beginning of the book is foolish. He's just stopped being a child, really. And then he should look more like a man by the end of the book.
I'm always looking for what characters are capable of at the end of a novel that they would not have been capable of at the beginning. For better or worse, whether that's robbing a bank or standing up for themselves. Who
knew with Macbeth at the beginning that he was capable of what he did, and then he has to become the man. I'm slightly drawing a slightly sublime, and that, not all books can quite. But you're so right that is a huge dynamic of a longer stretch of fiction. Again, I'm not sure a short story, apart from probably Alice Munro,
well, it needs to contain change, but it might be much more.
Not that slow transformation in just what you said, Rebecca. Just what somebody is capable of.
Yeah. I'll say I've made my peace with hi Lynn. I've made my peace with readers not loving short stories by reminding myself that every year I watch the Oscars and the short films awards come on, and I haven't seen any of those. They're great. They're important for the film industry. They mean a lot to filmmakers. They mean a lot to really, film buffs.
That's very true. Yeah.
See that?
What a great analogy. I'm so sorry to cut this off, but
I don't get 3 hours. Come on.
I want to give you 3 hours. Thank you so much, both of you. Thanks everyone who came and watched. We post all of our Crowdcast events on our channel. Feel free to go there and browse all the wonderful virtual events we've been doing the last 2 years. And again, thank you, Tessa. Thank you, Rebecca, for a wonderful conversation.
And Rebecca, who actually did transubstantiate in one place and reappear in another, miraculously. Thank you so much for doing that. You
By the end of this day, I'm capable of teleporting, and that's my transformation.
There we are. Add it to your CV.
Add it to your superpower list.
Yes.
All right.
I'm delighted that it worked out. We
Thank
got
you
a lovely
so
reading. It's all good.
Thank you. Be well.
Bye.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, women and children.